We studied about the APIs earlier, and we know that they are the way we transfer the data between front end and the back end. They are the waiters between the front website which we see and the server side which we don't see. So let's try to create the API in Django, a very simple API, and it will use the database which we created in the database with the JSON. So we'll be using those functions from there. And now let's go back to our code and let's try to implement some functions which will be the APIs for now. So the first thing, we have created this db.json. Let's try to tell it the Django that this is our database, and we can do that using this is where the first time we will see what is the use of settings.py file in the my site. So the settings.py file holds all the information which we want to give to our Django application. So the first thing which we need to give it is the location of our DB file. We can say it is DB file, and this is nothing but at this location this db.json file. Let's save it. Now, because we have declared this file in the settings.py file, now we can give the reference to this location from anywhere in our applications within any file. Let's close this and let's close this db. Let's make it to the side. Now let me close this URLs and the view. Now let me go to our Hello World application in Django project and let me open the views.py file. Earlier we saw how the URL is connected to the views, and we had one hello and a demo one URL. Now suppose we are uh, by further going into the example of making a product like an Amazon where we can sell the a thing like an e-commerce website. So let's try to create an API where we can see what the products are in our database and a way in which we can save the data coming from the front end. So we'll create a API which will be able to show us the data whenever we use the get to view the data, and post when we want to store the data in our database. So as we earlier we saw, we can have the request in two form, the get request and the post request. So this request in our methods are nothing but a way we can check the type of request which we are getting from this. On the basis of the request, we can then decide what to do. Now let's first create an API or the endpoint where we can see whatever is inside, or we can say to list all the objects which are saved in the men's category of the shirt. So within our database, we can say we want to print all the objects which are saved inside the list which is at the key of men. Similarly, we will have another endpoint for women. And at these two endpoints, we want two things. First, if this the request is get, which means if the person wants to see what's inside or the object, uh, then we will have to print the each and every object which is saved inside this men's list. And the second one is the post request, which means a person is trying to, the front end is trying to give us that object which we want to write inside our DB. So this is where we'll be using the get and the post request. Let me go back to views.py file and let's delete this demo request part, and we'll define one new function which will be, let's say, function for men. So men function, and again it will have the request as a parameter. Now, to distinguish the request from get and post, we will use an if-else condition. If the request.method is equals to get, then whatever comes, we'll do it here. Else, let's write it as else if request.method is post. So in that case, we'll do some logical expression here. So let's first write the function in function main in get request. So we know that in get request, we need to send all data or all object saved in men's list. And similarly, when there will be a post request, we need to save the data slash object coming from front end to men's list. So we know what exactly we need to do. Now we are talking about uh, sending, saving, and reading from the database. We saw from the database video how we had two functions. Let's try to import that. And as the starting of the video, we had one parameter in the DB files for specifying the DB location. So let's say our DB is that, and we can have that value from settings dot db file. First, we need to import the settings from Django config. From django.config import settings. From that settings, we imported that db file as a parameter called db. And similarly, from this db file, this db.py file, we want to import the read db and the write db. Now, first, let's try to read the database when we have the GET request. So, all of our data, which first our read DB will read the entire database along with the female, but we don't want to send the object save in a woman. So, we will have to filter that out. So, first, let's give it the parameter of file name, and this file name is whatever is inside the DB. And now our filtered data is the data. First key will be the database, and the second key will be the men because it's saved in the first in the database, then in the men section. So this field is a list. We cannot transfer list directly because as we saw earlier, we need to send the data in our JSON format. So let's try to make it back to JSON format. We can say this is the response, and response is a JSON file which says result, and then in front of that result we have this filtered data. Now let's return with a JSON response. because we are sending a JSON here, and this JSON response will contain our response, which is in dictionary form. Similarly, now let's try to create the post one. First thing is, how will we extract the object which is in the post request? So we'll see first. Let's just load our object which is saved in that post request. So we can call it as a variable called posted object is equals to, we'll use a JSON file here, JSON library with that JSON.loads. So let's try to import the JSON here, because finally we will have to convert it into JSON. So with the JSON.loads, here we will give the request, whatever the request is, this request dot body, and this request body, whatever there is, it will be converted into a JSON with the JSON.load. Now we can say uh, this dictionary object, this posted object, is what uh, is getting posted to us, but it might not be true, because the object can also be sent with some responses, like the main object might be saved as uh, response, then there can be the object which we are looking for. So we cannot save this whole thing, whole JSON, as an object. So let's suppose while the front end is sending the JSON, there it is one key is there, so that no one else can add any object in our database. So that key we need to match. So let's have an if statement which says, if inside this posted object we have this add key is equals to true, then we can extract the object from the obj key. So now the object is inside the obj key. So we are assuming that the JSON sent from the front end is something like first key is add, and in the front of it is a true. And if first we check if there is this key or not, if there is not this key, if the add is not there, then it will throw an error, and because someone else will be trying to post some object and then will throw an error. And if this add is there, then we will look for another key which is object, and inside this object we will have our object which actually we want to save in our database. So let's call our write_db and use this object as the object which we want to save, and the file name as we used above. Sorry, it should be db here. So the file name should go like this. Because every request must have a response, so that the system can flow eventually, so that everyone knows, okay, the request has been uh, taken by us and this is the response which you get. So once this is done, we need to send some response. So in the return, we'll have another response, and we can say that the request is completed, done, So in the response, we can say request is done. Now let's try to add this main function view to one URL, which in the APIs is called an endpoint. Let's go back to urls.py file. Instead of this demo, we'll have men, and the views demo.1 will have men function. This will be at /men. So let's see what exactly we'll be seeing here. When we'll go to base URL /men, let's add a slash here, /men, then we'll be able, we'll be actually viewing the men function. And what does this men function does? Let's have this small, just for the sake of viewing. This men function will have check first the request is of what type. Is it either a get type or the post type? We know that the browser, whenever it goes to some URL, it uses a get method by default. To use the post uh, method and how to generate a request which is of type post, we'll see that later. That can be done only from the front end part in the background, and the URL can only send a get request. So once we go to our uh, this URL base URL /men, we'll be going inside this men function if condition which is at get. And what it does is it takes the full data which is saved in the men section, and in the response we get a JSON. So we should see a JSON filled with all the objects which are saved in a DB file. Let's save it and let's go back to our server and see if it's still running. Yes, it is still running. Let's copy our link and let's open it back. This is the hello world. So our server is running. Now we go to our main section. As you can see, the response is in JSON, and there are basically in the results, as you can see, we have the response which says result, then the filtered data. So this result, inside this result, we have two objects. First is t-shirt of 1000 large brown, the one is t-shirt of 9000 with extra large and which is black. So these are the two objects which are saved in our database db.json file, and this is how we can read the DB using an API endpoint. Further, we'll see how can we actually post the data in our another endpoint. Sorry, the same endpoint. How can we send the data to that same URL and it gets saved here? But this is how we have created one endpoint in the API to view the database.